it started with Putin saying that they'll take Ukraine in 3 days. The bottom left, that's the turret of a Russian tank that was blown off. And the reality of it is Zelensky and Ukraine sort of uncovering what the Russian advancing army had done. And on the bottom right, of probably most interest to all of you, professionally speaking, at least, the lady there in the background is Russia's central bank chief, and the guy in the foreground is the special economic advisor to Putin. So in terms of what Putin wanted out of this war, we're going to talk a lot about geopolitics, but in terms of figuring out how to pay for it, it's those two people in the bottom right. And as you can tell, they were not having a good day that day, and they have not had a good day for the last 9 months. And so really, when I come down to sort of thinking about what is this conflict, it's all going to come down to basically the question of which thing is going to run out first. External support for Ukraine, the political support, military support, or basically Russia's economy. And that's, as over the course of the next half hour, that's what we'll be talking about. So just to give you the sense so that you have a preview of what I'm going to discuss, I'm going to basically ask and then answer 4 different questions. What is Russia's grand strategy? What led to war against Ukraine earlier this year, February 24th? How's the war going? Where might it lead? And what are the international commodity impacts of this conflict? And so when going through all this, the key sort of, how it all comes to, late November, pre-Thanksgiving 2022, is that this is something that's been cooking for, in effect, the last 20 to 30 years. Putin's grand strategy has been overcome the collapse of the USSR, get the United States to view Russia as a great power. And this is not about recreating the Soviet Union. Putin, and all the people around him will say that's the last thing on their mind. But what this war was about is preventing Ukraine from essentially becoming part of Europe. And when I say part of Europe, that means joining the European Union, changing its institutions, changing its political orientation. And so this is really a war of imperialism that we probably have not seen since maybe the 19th century. And the grand thing that Putin wanted out of Ukraine was that Ukraine looked a lot more like Belarus. In the Soviet Union times, Moscow paid basically, to support all of the other 14 republics within the Soviet Union. What Belarus is today is a country that rules itself, but on all the foreign political, security, economic issues that Russia or Putin cares about, all of their decisions have to be approved in Moscow. Ruling themselves, but the important things are in a different capital. That's basically what Putin wanted for Ukraine. The war is going to last probably another year or so, because we're in a new era of international relations. One of the tidbits that's been coming out, because the new NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that's how the Department of Defense funds itself. So basically, they're in the sort of the last stages of getting next year's passed. So they have to basically account, as you can imagine, where's the money gone over the past year. And one of the tidbits that came out is that the Department of Defense has spent roughly 6.5, 7% of its budget for this year on the war between Russia and Ukraine. We have also seen at the same time Russia lose more than half its military capabilities. After this war is over, they're not going to be able to fight another war 10 years, maybe more. And just one of the other tidbits that came out when I was looking at this is that if we think of all the the tech stocks over the last year, Tesla, Twitter, obviously, Meta, Facebook, all the big tech companies have lost more money off their market capitalization than the United States has spent on this war. So we're really talking about sort of both big figures, but in context, Russia is going to be deleted as a great power for years to come. And then when we think about what are the international commodity impacts, Europe is decoupling basically energy from Russia. And then what I wanted to focus in on as basically the last little segment is to talk about the Black Sea grain deal and how it just got renewed and the role that Turkey and the UN play in that, which is in effect bringing a lot of stability to an issue that caused a lot of consternation, particularly in the developing world. So just to sort of bring you back, one of the things that I always try to explain in talks like these is, where do grievances, where do resentments come from? Where did, in essence, the modern sort of like Russian foreign policy and grand strategy come from? And it comes from the difference between 1989 and 1991 as basically important dates in contemporary international European and Russian history. If you look at the top left, you see George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. It was the 80s because the pinstripe suits were, in effect. And you have then, this is them meeting in December 1989 at a summit off the coast of Malta. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was basically falling apart, as all the different places. If you remember the scenes of Czechoslovakia, what existed, obviously East Germany, Hungary, Poland, the Solidarity Movement, Václav Havel, this is happening at that time. And so the leaders of the United States and Soviet Union get together, and Bush basically has one question for Gorbachev. Czechoslovakia is one thing, Poland's another, but what about East Germany? Is the Soviet Union going to basically send the Red Army in order to ensure that East Germany and West Germany don't reunify in some way, or that the Soviet Union doesn't lose East Germany? Because that was the crown jewel of its World War II conquest. East Germany was how the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union organized its basically defense against NATO. And Gorbachev was very clear. All these countries will find their own way to socialism. My chief interest, my core interest, is in perestroika at home. I need to concentrate on domestic reforms. And Bush then understood. There's no Soviet leader who's insincere, who's going to give up all of this territory, all this power, all this influence, all this control. And that was basically the peaceful end to the Soviet Union, or to the Cold War. And what Gorbachev and Bush thought was going to result from this is that over the next years, decades, however long it took, that the issues of international security and European security would be negotiated by these two countries. That even if the US is the most powerful country on earth, and clearly Soviet Union is number two, the distance between number two and number three is so great that it's still about two different countries basically working together to govern the world. That's in effect what Gorbachev understood, thought was about to happen. Soviet Union still exists, Red Army is still very powerful. He's going nowhere. But obviously, once he gets rid of the external empire, again, Czechoslovaks, East Germans, Poles, Romanians, Bulgarians, etc., what happens inside the country is that you have places like Lithuania, Georgia, Moldova, other countries, Ukraine, obviously, other countries which say, oh, we came into the Russian Empire at different points relative to like post-World War II Eastern European countries, but we're also not Russians. Can we leave too? And that starts the pressure between basically pro-reform, exhibited by Gorbachev, hardliners who want nothing to happen, and then finally, as you see in the picture on the bottom left, the pro-independence leaders who are basically, not as important as the guy you might recognize there, putting his finger in what is, at that point, still his boss's face. Boris Yeltsin had been elected the leader of Russia within the Soviet Union. And if you can just close your eyes and think of your boss, or think of someone very important in your life, and just imagine sticking your finger in his or her face, now imagine doing that on national television. This is after the coup that had attempted to remove Gorbachev from power. And it's clear at that point that Yeltsin is so empowered and so much more popular than Gorbachev that there is a difference between the formal power exemplified by Gorbachev and the informal power exemplified by Yeltsin. And if you then look to the picture on your right, You see Yeltsin, he's the guy sitting in the far right of our picture. And with him and his colleagues from Belarus in the middle and Ukraine on the left, it's him leading his colleagues, pulling the Slavic core outside of the Soviet Union. And that's the key difference between 1989, Gorbachev thinking that he's going to basically co-govern the world with the United States, and the reality of 1991, in which Yeltsin pulls Russia out of the Soviet Union in order to get rid of all the obligations that Russia had to the others. And that at its core was, and at the end, what you're seeing there in that picture, that's the end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev at that point recognizes a Soviet Union exists, but without Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, there's simply no point, and the country is over. That's part one of the grievance. Part two is, what did the US do or not do? No new Marshall Plan. Several big reasons. If you remember James Carville from that era, it's the economy, stupid. George H.W. Bush had been the person who oversaw the peaceful end of the Cold War, the Gulf War, and the peaceful end of the Soviet Union. So his core strength was, perhaps it's unclear, if in the future we'll ever have a foreign policy president, a person as good at foreign policy as President Bush. But suddenly his big success is a liability, because as the country tips into recession, if you remember the phrase, it's the economy, stupid, that was the direction that Carville gave to every single Clinton campaign proxy. There's no question that you cannot pivot back into the economy to go after the weakness of our opponent, rather than concentrating on the weakness of our candidate, which is his relative lack of foreign policy experience. Additionally, there's no big apology from the Russians. If you read the congressional testimony, congressional floor speeches during that time, in effect, you have a lot of people who want the Soviet Union, and now Russia, to apologize for all aspects of the Cold War, for the Cold War itself. And from the Russians' perspective, they ended the Cold War, they ended the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they ended the Soviet Union. So in essence, the Marshall Plan, a new Marshall Plan, should be one of gratitude. Whereas from the US perspective, it's, well, you lost fair and square. And so they turned, and so in essence, who's responsible for the Cold War is a question that's left unanswered. It's unclear how much money would be enough. Gorbachev says to then Secretary of State in 1989, money has a way of disappearing in our country. So the United States focuses on non-proliferation. Some of you may remember Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar. The Nunn-Lugar Act is basically what paid nuclear scientists to not go rogue. Even though most, James Bond and similar type of action movies over the 1990s had basically a rogue Russian nuclear physicist as the main villain. But that's basically what the US did in reality. We effectively paid for the Russian nuclear industry in order to make sure that that talent basically stayed fed, stayed clothed, stayed housed, and encouraging and ensuring the continued Russian withdrawal from Europe, and that the main institutions of post-Cold War European governance would be NATO and the European Union, and not the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which had Russia as a member. So basically, how we think of Europe as still being dominated by the United States, by NATO in terms of security, and by the European Union in terms of everything else, those were conscious decisions made in the early 1990s. And from the Russian perspective, and this is where we start to get into the modern day, this is their memory of the 1990s. Whereas we think of it, this entire period, as one of increasing freedom and prosperity, and you see a guy wearing a traditional, Ushanka hat, suddenly newfound access to McDonald's. Remember those styrofoam containers of the early 90s? People also remember when their pensions suddenly became worthless, old people having to sell all their stuff directly onto the street. Once upon a time, you wake up in a new country. So these are people who go from thinking they're a superpower, or they were superpower, to basically this sort of obvious, unexpected urban poverty. That's really the psychological shock that Vladimir Putin has basically grown and nurtured and basically exacerbated over the past 22 years that he's been in power. What Putin has done, and sort of like we can go into Russian domestic politics in the Q&A, is he's ensured that there are no domestic political competitors. So the only real competition that he has is the 1990s. The collapse, the feeling of humiliation, personal humiliation, national humiliation. That's essentially the wound that he keeps picking at in order to say, things might be better in other countries. But do you remember how it used to be before I got here? What do you think will happen after I'm gone? That's in essence how Putin stays in power on an indefinite basis. And also, excuse me, to his elites, to the wealthy people of Russia, he basically has a similar message for them. After I'm gone, who's going to protect you from the rest of society? So everyone has a different reason for wanting Putin to rule as long as possible. And so when we then think about, and we'll turn to the geopolitics and the war in Ukraine in just a second, why don't the people of Russia, the elites of Russia, just say, we're clearly losing, let's try to negotiate so that we don't lose everything on the battlefield? It's because in terms of the domestic politics of Russia, life without Putin is much worse than life with Putin. And that even covers how badly they're doing in the conflict. So when we then think about what is Putin's grand strategy, what's the big foreign policy ideas that essentially hold Russia together, it's to make the world look more like 1989, Gorbachev negotiating the end of the Cold War, than 1991, Yeltsin pulling the country out of the Soviet Union. To limit the power of the West, return Russia to the upper echelon of great powers, and create a new multipolar era of international relations. So if we think of the Cold War as, bipolar, there were two big powers. The 1990s and, into the early 2000s as a unipolar, unicycle, bicycle. The multipolar era of international relations is Putin's argument that obviously the United States is the most powerful country in the world. China's number two. On some metrics, China might be more wealthy than the US, etc. But there's a clear number one, clear number two, that even though there's a big gap between number two and number three, where Russia is, the distance between number three and number four, whoever that may be, is so great as to essentially force the United States and China to revise the rules of international order to include Russia from the get-go. And that basically is what Putin's been talking about, for the last 15 years or so. So I'll skip ahead, but in essence, when we then think about, and we can go back to this, what were Russia's wars before Ukraine, is basically to learn from the lessons of Chechnya, in which they they invaded basically their own province, and those are Russian troops on a infantry fighting vehicle that is in Grozny, which is a Russian city. So basically they shelled a rebellion's province into submission. Is that instead of trying to fight wars, they'd fight these basically special operations. And a special operations is you do one very specific thing in order to knock out the enemy, but without the intention of really holding on to entire countries. So that obviously is learning from, as we'll see in a second, what were the lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq that Russia took from the United States and its partners. So in a short course, they wanted to modernize their capabilities, basically shape information, like the information environment, make sure that they have the right story on the international news media, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and basically just avoid large conflicts with better armed adversaries. And so we see on the top right, that's the Russian soldiers on their way to the Georgian capital in 2008. Tbilisi is Georgia's capital. And on the bottom left, we see a guy handing a cat to a kid. And that picture is actually one of the great information successes and information operation of Russia's annexation of Crimea. Because one, you have a little kid, let's say roughly 10 years old or so, wearing a jacket of Ukraine's colors. We also know that cats are notoriously skittish creatures. Children can be easily frightened by guns. So if we then see a cat being handed to a kid, then obviously that scene must be very peaceful. And we don't pay attention to the fact that that heavily armed soldier doesn't have any insignia on. And there's actually a statue of this picture in Simferopol, one of the major Crimean cities, today, because that kid and that cat were both plants. That's a trained cat that is trained to be calm. And that's what the Russians were able to do. And what we have, and so when we then think about what did Russia learn from America's wars, that's the last general leaving Afghanistan. And obviously we see in the bottom left, President Trump, when he was having obviously more, let's say, a different sort of relationship with NATO than his predecessors and his successor, that what we can see is that what Russia learned from America's wars is that NATO's capabilities can overwhelm anyone. What inhibits NATO are war weariness in the US public, which President Trump was reflecting at that time, political differences among NATO members, what he was obviously displaying at that time. And so therefore, the way that Russia was going to get what it wants is to make it too costly for America and therefore break up Western unity. And this is what we saw in Ukraine. And here, the big issue is, what did Russia want out of Ukraine? And on the bottom left, that's Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. On the top left, this is the Maidan, which started the Euromaidan, which you may have heard of. That's the thing that started 9 years ago, actually yesterday. This was when Ukraine was going to sign a free trade deal with the European Union, but Russia wanted Ukraine to sign a free trade deal with itself. And when the Ukrainian president said in public, he's going to go and sign the European deal, they actually literally set up the summit for him to come and sign. And quite literally hours before he was set to go, he instead gets a call from Moscow, heads on a plane to Moscow, returns and says, I'm not signing any trade deals, but Russia's going to give us a big loan, cheap gas, and we are going to have various other trade benefits from them. That's what brings people onto the streets of Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine there. And from there, the government is unable to exert control. It becomes violent, and eventually that Ukrainian president is chased from the country. The annexation of Crimea happens in short order. The Russians back separatists. MH17 gets shot down, and that verdict actually just came. It was just decided last week. So on and so forth. You're familiar with the rest of that story. In effect, what Russia is trying to get out of all of this is to eliminate Ukraine as a quote-unquote normal European country, because that would mark the end of Russia's ability to be taken seriously as a great power. Because Russia looks at the US and says, okay, the US has what? 40, 50, 60 different allies and partners. China has, they don't have as many allies, but they do have a lot of countries that they are, essentially the main partner of right now. Whom does Russia have? Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, all lovely countries to visit, but they're not going to basically move the needle on international affairs. Ukraine is in effect Europe's largest country that was not in a bloc so far. And what Russia wanted is for Ukraine either to be in Russia's bloc or to not exist in the same meaningful sense that it did up until that point. If it's not going to be with Russia, then it's going to be broken apart in some way. And so in April of last year, the Russians started massing their troops. You may remember Presidents Biden and Putin met in Switzerland in June of last year. By November of last year, remember this is already the issue of international intensity and so forth. Lots of people starting to go to Moscow to try to plead with Putin not to do the war, and Russia comes out with its demands that Ukraine must undergo denazification. And so obviously we think of Nazis as, Germans from 1933 to 1945. For the Soviets, not the Russians, for the Soviets, the Nazis were not only their direct enemies, the Germans, in World War II, but anyone who was with the Germans. And therefore, anyone who opposed Soviet power was a Nazi. And so as Russia looks at itself as the successor of the Soviet Union, anyone who's opposed to Russia is also a Nazi. So anyone who entered politics from basically that picture on the top left to the present must leave politics altogether, so that Putin and Russia can then install their own puppets, their own local allies, as the rulers of Ukraine. Ukraine must also submit to demilitarization. That means removing any weapons that threaten Russia, so that Russia can invade at a moment's notice and Ukraine can't resist. And then to recognize the territorial revision that existed up until that point. For NATO and the United States, basically NATO has to cancel itself. Putin loves talking about cancel culture. He really does. But he said that NATO has to go back to NATO and the United States and Germany doesn't have to split Germany once more, like East Germany, West Germany as it used to be, but all other changes have to be reversed. Removing military infrastructure from the hundreds of miles closest to Russia, no new members, including Ukraine, but also Finland, Sweden, anyone else, halt all activities in the former Soviet Union, so the Baltic states are thus left defenseless, and to remove nuclear weapons from Europe. So this is basically a level of power that Russia asserted for itself that didn't even exist, in the Soviet Union times. And this is really like the effect of what the Russians wanted, is they wanted to turn back the clock to a balance of power that had not existed for decades. And what they were basically doing at this point is saying, all of this stuff is, obviously Ukraine's not going to do any of this, NATO's not going to do any of this, America's not going to do any of this. And so therefore, they're going to give up on Ukraine rather than face the humiliation and the violence that comes with Russia just winning a really fast war against a bigger country. And that was the Russian mindset, that from Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014, Syria 2015, Ukraine 2022 was just going to be the largest possible special operation. And what they basically got out of it wasn't that Ukraine was the biggest special operation, is that Ukraine was in effect a relatively mid-sized, and over the course of this war is now getting to be a relatively strong NATO caliber military. And that was basically the mismatch. The Russians thought they were getting a weakling, and they find out that this weakling had been working out, studying martial arts, and that the big, schoolyard fight was a lot more even than it looked. And even though Russia is a much bigger country, it still to this day has many more capabilities in terms of artillery and things of that nature, the Russians fundamentally miscalculated what they are about to get. They thought that the Ukrainians would they believe their own propaganda. So they believed that Ukraine, the people would just not fight for Zelensky, but would fight to reunify with Russia. Because obviously that's what Putin was being told, because that's what he was saying. And so because no one wanted to disappoint the boss, here we are. Because the Russians had telegraphed a very specific type of war that they would do, they pursued a concerted buildup for nearly a year. The United States, President Biden, declassified basically all of their attack plans, and therefore opened up the information space to the Ukrainians to get worldwide opinion against Russia. And so the strategy, operational concepts, logistics, and tactics all failed to cohere. And the guy on the bottom right, that's the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. And so the United States and NATO didn't enter the war, depriving an easier domestic story for Russia. Russia tells its people, we're fighting NATO, we're fighting the Americans. They didn't get that. So they have to now figure out why these people that they totally disrespect and dehumanize, why they're fighting so well. And obviously part of that is the overt weapons transfers to Ukrainians and the broad sanctions regime, which has catalyzed Russia's deglobalization and the stress into its economy. The Russians had thought they would force the surrender by the rapid capture or elimination of political leadership in Kyiv, that they would take Kyiv in 3 days, and therefore would be collecting surrenders for the next couple of weeks. They would encircle major cities, capture smaller towns to break resistance, and create a land bridge going northeast from Crimea and southwest from basically the Donetsk and Luhansk, People's Republics, these Russian-backed little statelets whose recognition had catalyzed the conflict. And as I mentioned, basically, Putin projected Russia onto Ukraine and therefore didn't understand that Ukraine was a totally different country. So they didn't fight the right war. They didn't fight basically the right, in essence, preparation for an extended land conflict. And so for those of you with military background, you know that whether you're in the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, or just generally across DoD, the thing that the DoD excels in, its core function, isn't just having like the best technology, but having a strategic planning culture that is always being revised. And this is what the Russians didn't do. They imagined the war in which they won basically almost in a cost-free manner. And then said, you know what? That's essentially what's going to happen. Let's not plan for anything else. And that's where we see, mid-March 2022, that was basically, it started to seem that it was working, but then it didn't. Part of it was the sanctions regime limits Russia's ability to advance as a modern economy. And this was me on Bloomberg. And I like this particular screenshot because the chyron there said sanctions are beyond what anyone had anticipated. And if we then see the sort of the sanctions on the right, and basically briefings like this one, I had predicted the first 8. Basically every aspect of Russia would be sanctioned. And the most important out of all these is 100% the semiconductor export controls, the final product rule. Microchips don't go into Russia anymore. That is what Russia needs the most. And that's why they're having to import weapons from like Iran. That's why like imports of like washing machines and refrigerators skyrocketed in the last several months. They need the microchips to advance as a modern economy. And that's the thing that's actually going to crater Russia's economy for years to come. And also the Europeans basically sanctioned all of Russia's assets abroad, which were at then around $300 billion, which is going to be a very large sum of money for whoever comes after Putin, because that's when those monies will be unfrozen, and that person is going to have a real big piggy bank in order to then assert control over the rest of Russia. And just, the different components, the Russian aviation industry, there are no more spare parts coming in because many of their airplanes were leased and they didn't return them. And so in effect, just 2 weeks ago, Russia's version of the FAA approved the 3D printing of parts. They've also, at this point, over the last number of months, started to cannibalize planes, to just take apart working planes just to go for the parts themselves. There are no major shipping firms that operate to and from Russia. Basically, there are very few major commercial firms still operating inside Russia. Much of its energy production and transport has been decoupled, and the Chinese economic aid that they had anticipated didn't come to fruition. So where's the war now? And we can start to, get to the current day plus the commodities. The picture on the left, the red is what Russia controlled. The purple is what they had before the war, and the pink is basically their operating areas. March 18th, 2022, that was basically the extent of it. Yesterday's map, that's basically where they are now. So when we then think about what has happened over, basically the past 8 months or so, it's a story of Russia trying to conquer an entire country of 40 million people in less than a week. That not working, and so what they didn't anticipate is obviously the Russians are fighting, one basically imperial war for one person to basically revise the international order. So sort of like, a bit more abstract, a bit more ethereal. The Ukrainians are fighting for their homes, their families, like their literal houses, their language, their sovereignty, their ability to be themselves. So the Ukrainians are fighting much harder because they're fighting a war of liberation versus a war of territorial conquest. And when you think about the fighting spirit and the morale, that's the clear difference that we're observing. So casualties pretty intense on both sides, but again, because Ukraine is fighting one very specific type of war, they're basically like they've conscripted the entire country, and people are volunteering to fight. On the Russian side, they're relying on mercenaries, convicts, press-ganged Ukrainians, volunteer brigades, which I hadn't even heard of since like the Civil War, here in the U.S. from individual regions. And one of the jokes that's gone around, amongst like defense people is over the course of this conflict, Ukraine is evolving into a 21st century fighting force because they are, using up their Soviet era weapons and getting NATO stuff. So they're really fighting like a modern military. Also with their tactics, their logistics, all that. Whereas at the same time, Russia is evolving into a 20th century fighting force because they're running out of this stuff that relies on microchips. They're not replacing those, so they're just manufacturing, in essence, dumb weapons into more and more. So the strategy on the battlefield is try to lose as slowly as possible, so that they create popular demand for what I put enough already, limit Western support for Ukraine's, so that they can lock in territorial gains through negotiations and prepare for the next phase of conflict. So any negotiations now, it's just basically a prelude to the next conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But what's of interest to you guys, more specifically, is that they've been using food insecurity as a weapon. Because food insecurity can create civil instability, which means governmental instability, which means migration flows to Europe, and that's what they've been threatening Europe. And on the bottom left, that's them burning just Ukrainian wheat fields. On the top right, that's a Ukrainian grain silo that they bombed. And the top left is obviously the zones where they don't permit Ukrainian ships to sail. So what you guys know about probably quite a bit is already this Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was brokered between Ukraine and Russia, as you see the guys exchanging handshakes in the agreement, but that it was brokered by the United Nations, and that's in terms of the two guys seated. The guy on the left is the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and the guy on the right is the President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And they're the people who really brought together Ukraine and Russia to export grain. Obviously, the UN has a humanitarian interest, and Turkey has an interest of, in essence, increasing its power, both like among the global south, but also in the Black Sea, because they have not permitted, because they control the Bosphorus Straits, they did not permit Russian warships to come in, but they are permitting Ukrainian grain ships to leave. They reached it in July of this year, and even over the last couple of weeks, Ukraine has started to attack Russian naval assets in the Black Sea, and that prompted Putin to say he's going to leave the Black Sea grain deal. And then Erdogan actually called his bluff by saying Ukraine's going to export this grain, and Turkish ships are going to accompany them. If you want to fire on Turkish ships, that's your prerogative, but that's what we're going to do. And the next day, Putin said that his concerns were met, and therefore the grain deal will continue. And obviously, this means that, this is data from the UN as of yesterday. Corn, wheat, the two biggest items, that's more than 11.5 million tons of commodities that would otherwise not have been exported, that would not have reached, its destinations. And we can see there on the right, basically August and September, that's all from the Black Sea grain deal. That at its core is in essence, what's bringing more price stability to your industry. So where are we going to be for the next year or so is obviously the same issue that I raised earlier. How much of Ukrainian territory is Russia going to be able to basically hold on to? The war momentum is only going in one direction. Russia's not getting any better at fighting, even as Ukrainians are getting better at fighting. So it comes down to, you can see here that if you look at that picture, obviously these are Ukrainian people who have a big banner in English. It is meant to appeal to an external audience. And if you can look, I don't know how easy it is for you guys to see in the room, but if you look sort of right above the two L's of will, you can see the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. So obviously these Ukrainians are using like American political images, American symbols, in order to connect their basically struggle to political discussions and debates and symbols inside the United States. That's them trying to appeal to the West to say, we are worth backing because look at how we're doing. And on the left, that is obviously just a stock photo of a woman with basically just holding Russian currency. So still so far, Russian gains would be the third largest annexation and conquest since the end of World War II. Only India and basically India taking Kashmir and North Vietnam defeating South Vietnam has indicated are larger in terms of territory. And that's basically where we can end. So thank you for your attention. And I look forward to your questions. And hopefully this gives you enough in terms of the background, sort of the deep historical background, the run up to this conflict, how this conflict is going, and basically the big questions. Which is going to end first, Western popular and military support or the Russian economy? So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Weber. What questions do we have? And actually, Dr. Weber, can you hear us if we just use the microphones in the room?
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely hear through the microphone.
My question is, if Putin does start to lose Ukraine militarily, what do you think he would do? Would he use tactical or nuclear weapons?
So the question, as I understood it, was, if Putin does start to win, what would the West do if he used nuclear weapons?
Now,
if Ukraine starts to win, would he go to tactical weapons?
Well, would Putin use nuclear weapons if Ukraine starts to win?
correct.
Well, I think we've seen two things in that regard. One is obviously like in the global sense of like the conflict, like Russia's winning. Like they simply there are no Ukrainian troops in Russia, but there are somewhere between 150 and 200,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. So Russia is definitely winning this conflict. The momentum is going in Ukraine's direction. That's been true for probably the last couple months. We've also seen that when Russia is losing on the battlefield, they start to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, because that's in essence the fear they're trying to create in Western capital. Is nuclear conflict or the basically like nuclear weapons usage in Europe worth supporting Ukraine? The Russians haven't used it because at the same time, President Biden, secretaries of defense, state, etc., but also President of France and the head of the EU all said basically, if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, not even against NATO, but just against Ukraine, NATO and the broader West will respond. And like President Biden signaled, and again, all the various like European leaders signaled that the response is not going to be, is unlikely, unless like NATO gets attacked directly, is unlikely to be nuclear in response, but it will be, and these are the words that they use, massive, overwhelming, conventional. So we can think that basically Putin's calculus isn't what is Ukraine going to do about a nuclear weapon, but will NATO basically delete the Black Sea Fleet so that Russia's ability to conduct operations is therefore limited? Would you know, and it can go in lots of ways. Like in Washington, the big question when, you know, they started to threaten the nuclear power plant in a place called Zaporizhia is, would this be the moment in which like Japan would finally be able to reconquer the Kuril Islands? Because what's Russia going to do against the US in Asia Pacific? Is the United States going to start a massive carpet bombing in eastern Ukraine? Is NATO going to establish a no-fly zone? Is NATO going to basically like destroy all the shipping capabilities and like naval warships in the Black Sea and the Caspian, which are part of, you know, like Russia's war against Ukraine? And because all of those things seemed like more or less like within the realm of possibility, that's basically where the nuclear issue has died down, at least as a talking point from the Russians, is because President Biden was able to deter them. And at the same time, the Russians have been able to deter the like NATO from like entering the conflict, the United States from entering the conflict. We haven't joined, but they also haven't bombed any of the arms convoys going into Ukraine. So when I think about nuclear weapons, they're certainly able to use it, but the consequences are very clear. And I think that's why they haven't used it, so at least so far. And I don't anticipate that they would use it going forward unless, like, you know, Moscow, the Ukrainian soldiers like reach Moscow. Like that's basically the point where they would use nuclear weapons. But thank you.
How much of the agricultural infrastructure and farm production has been destroyed? How long will it take to rebuild it? And is the Western agribusiness folks willing to get in there and do that quickly?
Right. So a lot of Ukraine's port infrastructure, in particular has been damaged. But this is basically where so port infrastructure, a lot of grain infrastructure, particularly along the Black Sea coast, obviously has been attacked throughout the course of this war. When this war is over, this is basically, you know, in effect, why is the United States putting in so much money relative to the Europeans in Ukraine? It's exactly for moments like what you just said. Because once this conflict is over, who's going to take basically charge of reconstruction of Ukraine, and who's going to put their own business interests first? Obviously, Europe has a lot of money to spend on the reconstruction of Ukraine, but where the United States is going to basically assert its prerogatives is in issues like you just said. Which are the firms that are going to rebuild port infrastructure? Which are the firms that are going to rebuild the agricultural infrastructure? And basically, which firms are going to help basically bring Ukraine back into the international economy? The money the US spends today is meant to have a bigger say at the table later on. Because at the end of this conflict, and all conflicts come to an end at some point, is Ukraine basically evaluates who helped us the most. And that's what basically the money during the conflict is meant to do. And this has been one of like and so for your point about like agribusiness, you guys are one of the biggest, basically your lobbyists are some of the most like active in Washington writ large. And so the reconstruction aid that goes through basically US Agency for International Development, USAID, it's with your interests in mind. Like the Ukrainians will, you know, hopefully with their interests in mind too, but basically you guys go first. Ukrainians hopefully a close second, but you know, that's the way that reconstruction works. And that's basically one of the lessons that like US presidents have learned, or sort of like the US diplomatic establishment has learned since World War I and after World War II. If you don't take an active part in the conflict, you don't get to have an active part in how the peace looks like afterwards. And so that's why the US is like very involved in this. And you know, you can check through Cullen and basically like US Grains Council and all the sort of various you know, industry groups. The policies, like the interests are being articulated as we speak. So you'll have your opportunity. Thank you.
Well, I remember vividly World War II. And of course, when I heard that when one country, NATO country is attacked, all NATO will respond. And that put the chill in my heart, I'll tell you. But then I heard that each country can respond militarily, economically, or just a verbal assault. Do you have any comment on that?
So the question is, what can individual NATO countries do?
My question is, when it says that one NATO country is attacked, all NATO engine countries will respond. And I was assuming that that meant we'd shoot and have a military war. Would you comment on what the responses must be from other countries?
Sure. So NATO has actually a very short charter. And the two big things that NATO basically can do is held under Article 4 and Article 5. Article 4 just says, a country has its territory or sovereignty threatened, it can call the other countries for consultations. So, for example, that means that they can that's the power to call like a really important meeting. And that happens if they can show that, something bad has happened to them. And the Article 4 doesn't imply that anyone does anything. It just implies that basically a meeting can be called. Now, sort of when we think about like what is the reality of today is if the missiles that had just landed in Poland were from Russia, what Poland would have done is call for an Article 4 meeting so that they can say, here's the things that happened, here are the things that we need so that this doesn't happen again. Because obviously it was just 2 missiles, it wasn't like a full-fledged like invasion by the Russians. Article 5 says that a country can call upon the resources of the other states until such time as the issue can be brought before the UN Security Council. So that's the one for all for one that I think you're thinking of. It doesn't require anyone to do anything except to bring the issue to the UN Security Council. So in both 4 and 5, it just says, we're going to call a meeting. We're going to call a meeting with the intent of bringing this to the UN. Now, in reality, Russia's on the UN Security Council, so we could bring stuff to the UN Security Council until we're blue in the face, nothing's going to happen. And so that, in essence, is the difference between 4 and 5. Call a meeting to take an issue to the UN. Nothing obliges anyone to do anything except those things. Attend the meeting and support taking the issue to the UN. What states want to do, that's obviously up to them, their national interest, and their interest in upholding, their formal and informal commitments to NATO. But yeah, like, so for example, like in 1974, like Turkey invaded like Cyprus and took a portion of Cyprus from Greece. Like NATO didn't do anything about it because Greece didn't call for it, even though Greece as a NATO member was attacked, albeit from another NATO member. The only time that NATO has actually done anything in terms of like running into like, Article 4, then Article 5 is after 9/11. That's the only time NATO has acted as such.
Dr. Weber, first off, I think your presentation was fantastic. My question is a bit of a follow-up to what Don asked a little bit ago, but I'm going to turn it more domestic. So obviously what occurred in Ukraine brought tremendous amount of market volatility in the United States, not only in the agricultural commodity markets, but the energy markets as well. If you look in your crystal ball, how long do you think we'll continue to have the levels of volatility that we've seen this calendar year? And when do you predict there will be some stability that we'll see?
It's a great question. It's a crystal ball question, so I can only have like, my wild guess is only it'll be an informed wild guess. What we've seen over the past 8 months is that, in effect, let's say 3 things happen in a row. The realization that this was going to take a long time and that it would be really big, Europe basically taking the decision individually and then collectively that it was going to decouple from Russian energy. The volatility sort of interacting with like COVID, supply chain issues, inflation that had nothing to do with this conflict, but which were exacerbated by this. Basically, all of those things combined, from COVID to war and everything in between, that there is going to be, in some countries recession, obviously some countries better, worse, etc. Part of that is China's insistence on like zero COVID. That is probably the most important thing in the international economy right now. It's unclear, like, because Xi Jinping has put so much of his personal prestige on that, they're probably going to have that for a while. So when you put all those things together, the things that will basically have a clear outcome, like a clear endpoint, is Europe not totally decoupling from Russian energy, but that making Russia, instead of supplying 60-70% of, let's say, natural gas and oil on a year, on an annual basis, that this gets reduced to 5%, 10%, basically one as part of a mix. That's going to happen basically in 23. Like, there's the end of that. Once that happens, we are going to see basically what we're seeing right now is that interacting with, and basically like the conservation measures, supply diversification. Germany just finished basically in record time its first of, I think, 4 LNG plants, basically bringing in like US LNG, is that we're seeing basically the post-Russia world in terms of energy. That's essentially happening in this year. Therefore, we're going to see probably like prices rise above like their current recession levels, but the volatility will have come to an end by that point. So at least in energy volatility, by next winter, like a year from now, it's going to be, I would think it's going to basically reach its bottom in terms of just like the amount of volatility, or reach its height in terms of volatility. Thereafter, once people know what basically energy costs, people also know by this time next year, basically basically like how the war is going to end, because after another year of fighting, either Ukraine wins or Ukraine loses. But like eventually, like we're going to recognize, or we're going to see what are the limits of Ukraine's capabilities and Russia's capabilities. That makes me think that over the course of the next year, we start to understand what 24 and beyond look like. Also, like, I'm not a China expert, but from the stuff that I read, basically zero COVID is basically like completely unnerving like the major cities of China. And so like, we'll also see if the Chinese government finds a way to basically step down from that policy, or they're going to carry it on indefinitely. Because at that point, people will have been living under zero COVID and all like the restrictions on, whatever freedom of movement that people in China have, that'll have been 3 years of that. And basically, there's no people that can carry on a situation like that indefinitely. So in those big issues, clarity in terms of energy, clarity in terms of war, clarity in terms of China, those clocks are going to run out over the course of 2023. And that's, in essence, the building blocks of the international order thereafter.
Okay, I think we got time for one more question.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation, Jen. I guess I got the last question. You bring up China, and it brings up an interesting point as far as I'm concerned. Right now, you have US, China, and Russia as the top 3. If this war continues on and Russia continues to get beat beyond financially, does China come in as the white knight to Russia and say, hey, you join with us, we'll help rebuild your country, and now it's US versus China and Russia together?
So sure. So I think that, yeah, so I think like that's obviously the projection here, but it's not the projection in terms of Russia and China working together, like as allies or partners in any meaningful sense. Once this war is over, the best deal, Russia will be in a deeply subservient role to China. This is not junior partner. This is subordinate. Like, they will be taking orders from the Chinese. And obviously, like in terms of the rhetoric, they're like, we're anti-US, we're basically recreating the international order. But what China will have at that point is a much more subservient, let's say, partner that is going to be very, very expensive to reform. And even though, like, I've studied Russia basically for, at this point, about 17 years, this is the most pessimistic I've ever been about Russia after this war, because there's so many domestic problems in Russia that this war basically would just rip the cover off. Plus, given that they're going to be sanctioned, they're going to be experience this sanctions regime until Putin leaves office, but he still controls basically power at home very tightly. Russia's just going to be in a bad place in which it's unclear where their money's going to go for like a long time. So China's going to win basically a booby prize. It's not going to be a prize that's going to be worth very much. That, I personally believe, is going to be the major source of instability for like the 20 years after this war is done. But certainly until Putin's gone, we can't really think about what Russia looks like thereafter. And, he seems to be in okay enough health, so he'll probably hang on for another, 5, 10, 15 years. So that's, I think, the bigger problem thereafter. Not that China gets like, a loyal servant, is that China has a very angry, poor, and resentful, basically employee. That's the core thing that I see happening thereafter. But certainly, Russia and China are only going to be closer after this.
All right. Well, Dr. Weber, thank you so much for spending the time. Can we give him a round of applause, please?
For yourselves.
All right. Well, I definitely appreciate it, and I will be in touch. So thank you so much.
Okay. Happy trails. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Take care.